From New York, this is Democracy Now!
They take from us, the poor. They stick their hands in our pockets and they raise gas prices and diesel. You know we're poor. We're those who work every day, who farm. We need to work, and it hurts us. They forgive the rich and take from the poor. That's why we're here, to defend what is ours, nothing more.
Protests are continuing to rock Ecuador as tens of thousands of indigenous people and other demonstrators flood the streets of Quito to decry government-imposed austerity measures. The protests have forced the president of Ecuador to temporarily move the government out of Quito. We'll go to Ecuador for the latest. Then to the Democratic presidential candidate, Julian Castro.
Those who make it to the southern border of the United States should absolutely be able to make their asylum claim. If I were president right now, I would immediately end this Remain in Mexico policy, the metering policy, which is basically playing games with people at ports of entry who want to make their asylum claim.
Earlier this week, Julian Castro attempted to bring a group of disabled and LGBTQ asylum seekers across the U.S.-Mexico border, but the migrants were refused entry. Plus, we'll look at Tuesday's Supreme Court hearing to decide whether LGBTQ workers can legally be fired due to their sexual orientation or gender identity. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Trump said Tuesday he will not cooperate with the congressional impeachment inquiry, pushing the United States toward a constitutional crisis. The White House announced its decision in an 8-page letter addressed to House Democratic leaders, blasting the inquiry as partisan and unconstitutional. The letter arrived just hours after the Trump administration ordered a key witness in the impeachment probe, Ambassador Gordon Sondland, not to appear for his scheduled testimony on Capitol Hill yesterday. President Trump tweeted, quote, "Fortunately, he would be testifying before a totally compromised kangaroo court." Text messages turned over to Congress reveal Sondland helped to mediate conversations between Ukrainian officials and Trump's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, aimed at winning a promise from Ukraine's president to investigate Joe Biden and his son in exchange for hundreds of millions of dollars of U.S. military aid that Trump had placed on hold. On Capitol Hill, House Intelligence Committee Chair Adam Schiff said Tuesday Democrats would issue a subpoena ordering Sondland to appear before Congress and to hand over electronic messages related to the investigation. Schiff said the White House's decision to stonewall the impeachment probe is further evidence of obstruction.
This is one of the few impeachment inquiries in the history of our country. It goes to the core of whether the president abused his office to seek political help in his re-election campaign, and did so to the detriment of our nation's security. Did so by effectively coercing a country that has been invaded by Russia to investigate a rival and condition the relationship between this country and that country on whether they were willing to play ball.
Turkey's government says its troops are prepared for an imminent assault on Kurdish fighters in northern Syria after President Trump ordered U.S. troops to fall back from their positions on the Turkish-Syrian border. Kurdish fighters said they're bracing for a humanitarian catastrophe, saying in a statement this attack will spill the blood of thousands of innocent civilians because our border areas are overcrowded, unquote. This follows warnings that former Kurdish allies of the U.S. who feel betrayed by President Trump will abandon thousands of prisoners captured during the U.S.-backed war against ISIS over the past 2 years. Afghanistan's National Intelligence Agency says a top al-Qaeda leader was killed last month in a joint U.S.-Afghan military operation that killed at least 40 civilians at a wedding party, including 12 children. Afghan officials said the September 23rd attack in the Musakala district of Helmand province also left 22 Taliban. Among them, they claimed, was Asim Omar, who led al-Qaeda's affiliate in the Indian subcontinent since its formation 5 years ago. A Taliban spokesperson rejected the claims, calling them propaganda aimed at covering up a massacre of civilians. Congressional Democrats and foreign service workers are condemning the Trump administration's plans to withdraw the U.S. from the Open Skies Treaty, which allows member states to carry out unarmed surveillance flights over each other's territories to verify arms control agreements. In a letter to the White House Monday, House Foreign Affairs Committee Chair Eliot Engel warned any withdrawal from would benefit Russia, which annexed Crimea after invading Ukraine in 2014. Congressmember Engel wrote, quote, observation flights under the treaty have generated additional information regarding Russian military action in Ukraine and provided a check on further Russian aggression there, unquote. This comes just 2 months after President Trump formally withdrew the U.S. from the INF Treaty. That's the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty with Russia, the landmark 1987 agreement banning all nuclear and non-nuclear missiles with short and medium ranges. British officials are asking the Trump administration to reconsider granting diplomatic immunity to a U.S. suspect in the death of a 19-year-old motorcyclist. Harry Dunn died after he was struck by a car in late August near an Air Force base in central England. British police say U.S. citizen Anne Tsoukalos had been driving on the wrong side of the road ahead of the crash. They say she fled the country after learning that Dunn had died. Tsoukalos is the wife of a U.S. intelligence officer, and the State Department has argued she has full diplomatic immunity. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson Monday called on her to return to the UK.
I do not think that it can be right to use the process of diplomatic immunity for this type of purpose, and I hope that Anne Tsoukalos will come back and will engage properly with the processes of law as they're carried out in this country.
The Supreme Court heard oral arguments Tuesday in 3 cases that'll determine whether LGBTQ people can be fired from their jobs due to their sexual orientation or gender identity. Among the court's conservative justices, only Neil Gorsuch appeared open to prohibiting such workplace discrimination. Outside the court, plaintiff Amy Stevens, who was fired from her job at a funeral home in 2013, joined a rally hosted by supporters. This is Laverne Cox, award-winning transgender actress.
I hope no matter what our justices decide, that Americans know that it should not be okay to discriminate against someone simply for being who they are. If we do not win this case, then the people, then our legislature needs to make it clear that discrimination against anyone because of who they are should not be the way that we live our lives here in the United States of America.
The Supreme Court is expected to hand down its decision in the 3 cases by early next summer. We'll have more on Tuesday's action in the Supreme Court later in the broadcast, and you can go to democracynow.org to see our full interview with Laverne Cox. California's largest utility company, PG&E, says it's begun shutting off electricity to 800,000 customers as dry, windy conditions have increased the threat of wildfires in 34 of California's northern and central counties. The unprecedented blackouts follow last year's devastating Camp Fire, which killed 85 people, the deadliest blaze in California history. Investigators found that poorly maintained PG&E transmission lines started that fire last November. Climate scientists say hotter and drier conditions across California due to rising greenhouse gas emissions have made wildfires more widespread and more intense. Voters in Montgomery, Alabama, have elected an African-American mayor for the first time in the city's history. Probate Judge Stephen Reed captured 2/3 of ballots in a runoff election Tuesday. Montgomery was once the capital of the Confederacy. In the 50s, it became the epicenter of the civil rights movement as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks led the successful Montgomery bus boycott to desegregate public transportation. A new book offers chilling details about an incident that led NBC to fire Today Show host Matt Lauer in 2017. Journalist Ronan Farrow writes in his new book, Catch and Kill, that Lauer raped NBC producer Brooke Nevels in a hotel room in Sochi, Russia in 2014 as they covered the Winter Olympics. Nevels called the incident excruciatingly painful and said it left her bleeding for days. Multiple other women have accused Matt Lauer of sex crimes. The New York Times reports one former NBC employee was summoned by Lauer to his office in 2001, where he allegedly locked the door and sexually assaulted her until she passed out. A new analysis finds the wealthiest 400 families paid a lower share of the U.S. tax burden last year than people in any other income group. The finding comes from new research by UC Berkeley economists Emmanuel Saez and Gabriel Zuckman in their forthcoming book, The Triumph of Injustice: How the Rich Dodge Taxes and How to Make Them Pay. A dramatic animated graph of the research's data produced by the New York Times shows the U.S. tax system becoming far less progressive over 7 decades. In 1950, the total tax rate for the wealthiest 400 families stood at 70%. After President Trump's tax cuts for the wealthy took effect, the tax rate on U.S. billionaires had fallen to just 23%. Vermont Senator and 2020 presidential hopeful Bernie Sanders said Tuesday he'll scale back the number of campaign events he participates in as he recovers from a heart attack he suffered last week at a rally in Las Vegas. Sanders says he still plans to join the October 15th televised debate of the top 12 Democratic candidates. Over the weekend, Sanders' daughter-in-law, Rain Riggs, died of neuroendocrine cancer just 2 days after her diagnosis. She was married to Senator Sanders' son, Levy. She was just 46 years old. In Brazil, human rights groups are warning in an open letter that the Amazon's last uncolonized indigenous people face genocide amidst raging fires and mounting incursions into their territories. The warning comes after the government of far-right President Jair Bolsonaro abruptly fired the head of the government agency tasked with protecting uncontacted tribes. Brazil's Indigenous Missionary Council warns the number of invasions of indigenous territories has doubled under Bolsonaro, with more than 150 such incidents since January. And there have been a record 87,000 forest fires in Brazil this year, according to official figures, many of them deliberately set to clear land. In a statement, the indigenous rights group Survival International said, quote, President Bolsonaro wants to open up indigenous territories across Brazil to loggers, miners and ranchers. He doesn't care how many indigenous people die in the process and has openly expressed his racist contempt for them on many occasions, unquote. This comes as Pope Francis welcomed indigenous leaders from Amazonia to the Vatican for a gathering of bishops known as a synod. The 3-week meeting will focus on the Catholic Church's efforts to safeguard the Amazon. This is Pope Francis speaking Sunday.
May God preserve us from the greed of new forms of colonialism, the fire set by interests that destroy, like the fire that recently devastated Amazonia, is not the fire of the gospel.
Elsewhere in Brazil, a massive oil slick has fouled more than 900 miles of beaches along the country's northeastern coast, affecting 46 cities and some of South America's most popular beaches. Brazil's environmental agency says tests of the oil show it's not of Brazilian origin. The source of the crude oil remains unknown. In Canada, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says he'll appear at a court ruling from September that found Indigenous youth were, quote, willfully and recklessly harmed under Canadian child welfare policies. The appeal could block some $2 billion Canadian dollars worth of reparations for at least 50,000 Indigenous youth who were removed from their homes as children and impacted by the severe underfunding of federal child welfare programs for the Indigenous community. The Canadian Human Rights Tribunal ruled last month the federal government had purposely discriminated against Indigenous youth and ordered the government to pay $40,000 Canadian dollars to each child who was removed from their homes. A study by the University of New Mexico found hundreds of Navajo women presented alarming levels of uranium in their systems, even decades after mining of the radioactive metal ended on the reservation. Of nearly 800 Navajo women who are part of the federally funded study, at least 1/4 tested positive for high levels of uranium. A group of babies also showed uranium levels far higher than the national average. New Mexico Congressmember Deb Haaland and other Democrats are pushing for legislation to expand compensation to people exposed to uranium. And 16-year-old Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg met with Indigenous youth climate leaders Tuesday as she visited the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation in North Dakota. Thunberg was welcomed by 16-year-old high school student Takata Iron Eyes, who was just 12 years old when she joined protests against the Dakota Access Pipeline in 2016. Takata Iron Eyes later appeared with Greta in a video produced by the Lakota People's Law Project urging Congress to stop the Keystone XL pipeline.
Indigenous peoples have been on the front lines of the climate crisis, and we know how to live in balance with the earth. And so when we're talking about solutions, we have to include Indigenous peoples in the conversation. So let's protect our indigenous peoples, their rights, their communities, their way of life, because that's what we're going to need when we go into this battle.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world. We begin today's show in Ecuador, where tens of thousands of people led by indigenous leaders are expected to again bring the country to a standstill today in massive ongoing anti-government protests. Demonstrators flooded the streets of Quito Tuesday to decry government-imposed austerity measures and a steep hike in fuel prices, despite a severe police crackdown. Civil unrest has been growing since President Lenin Moreno ended a decades-old fuel subsidy program last week as part of a so-called reform plan imposed by the International Monetary Fund after Ecuador took a $4.2 billion loan from the IMF earlier this year. He also announced plans to cut public sector job wages by 20%, require public workers to pay a day's worth of pay to the government each month, and slash their vacation days in half. On Tuesday, the sixth consecutive day of massive demonstrations, protesters successfully pushed through security lines at the National Assembly before being pushed back by police. Indigenous protesters approached the presidential palace. Police responded with violence and tear gas. On Tuesday night, President Moreno declared an 8 p.m. curfew in areas near government buildings. This is one of the protesters, Santiago Iwamba, in the streets of Quito.
Just like in the period of the economic reforms in 1983, we want these economic measures to be canceled. Indigenous communities are here in front of you. We have the vote. Long live the indigenous movement.
President Moreno declared a state of emergency last week, allowing police to raid homes without warrants and suspending the right to assembly. Hundreds of people have been arrested. The government's also cracking down on the media. Police raided the community radio station Radio Pichincha Universal on Tuesday. Meanwhile, the defense minister, Osvaldo Jarin, has called protesters terrorists and criminals, threatening them with the threat of lethal weapons in a television interview Monday. Yesterday's mass protests come one day after President Moreno said in a national address he's temporarily moving the government from Quito to the southern city of Guayaquil. He accused his political opponents of attempting a coup and vowed not to restore the fuel subsidy.
What has happened here in recent days is not a manifestation of social discontent in protest of government decision. No, the lootings, vandalism, and violence show there is an organized political motive here to destabilize the government and break the constitutional order, break democratic order.
Ecuador's former president, Rafael Correa, said Tuesday Moreno must resign or call early elections. And protesters are vowing to stay in the streets. This is the indigenous leader, Jaime Vargas, speaking to reporters in Quito earlier this week.
Different social groups are going up against the neoliberal government of Lenin Moreno, mobilizing, uniting, and organizing as the only way to defend the interests of the Ecuadorian people.
For more, we go to Quito, Ecuador, where we're joined by David Cordero Heredia, a law professor at Pontifical Catholic University. He's one of the lawyers representing protesters who've been detained in this latest round of protests. He was previously a human rights fellow at Cornell University. Professor Cordero Heredia, thank you so much for being with us. I know there's a bit of a sound delay, but if you can start off by talking about what's happening in the streets right now and what they are responding to and what are their demands.
Hi, Amy. Good morning. Do you hear me? Okay. Right now we are in a state of exception. Since last week, we got protests in the streets, when manifestations, especially for the indigenous movement. We calculate like over 2,000 indigenous peoples are now in the capital. Yesterday there was very tough repression from the armed forces of Ecuador. Because of the state of exception, the president is able to use the army to repress people in the streets. So we are very, very worried about that. We know that the international standards about human rights prohibit to use the army to repress people in the streets in these kind of manifestations. We demanded to the Constitutional Court to take a role in this and to revoke the order of President Moreno of the state of exception, and to demand him to respect human rights of the people in the streets. And the court sadly disappoint the people of Ecuador, and he said that the state of exception is constitutional. So right now we got 30 days in which the president will have full powers and the use of the full armed forces of Ecuador. We got several detainees. The president himself said yesterday that over 2,000 people all over the country are detained. We know for sure that yesterday night, 83 people were detained, indigenous people especially, in the protests in the streets, and they were not taken to the official place where they should be presented to a judge. That is the Unidad de Flagrancia, where they should be conducted. We suspect that they were taken to a military base in the north part of the city, but we don't have right now. We don't have official information about them. We are very, very worried about them. We presented an habeas corpus writ to the courts, and we are trying to know where they are.
Well, Professor Cordero Heredia, I wanted to ask you, most people, when they hear the word austerity measures, it's kind of vague, but some of the specifics that this IMF deal is requiring of Ecuador are amazing, considering where Ecuador has gone in the past few years. They're talking about raising fees for all government services and for utilities, imposing a new value-added tax, a consumption tax, raising the ceiling on interest rates so that banks can charge whatever interest rates they want. And they're also prohibiting the central bank from lending money to the public sector. And so all of this stuff, considering where Ecuador has gone during the reign of his predecessor, the poverty rate in Ecuador dropped from 64% in 2000 to only 21%. That's an astonishing drop in the number of people in poverty. And this is going to really reverse all of these gains that were made under President Correa, although there are many criticisms of President Correa. How did this happen, especially since Lenin Moreno is from the same party as President Correa?
Yes, this is really interesting. What is going on now in Ecuador is that we got a budget gap that should be filled in some way. I think the whole population is conscient that some kind of measure should be taken. This problem started with President Correa, who was not. Who was not efficient using or taking measures of economy measures in Ecuador, and he gave President Moreno a big problem regarding budget. So it's not a problem that started with President Moreno; it started with President Correa. And when President Correa needs extra funds to fund in the state, he started a very aggressive campaign of extraction of oil and mining, especially in the Amazon region, in indigenous people's territory without consultation. And the indigenous movement had been protesting since Correa and now with President Moreno because these two presidents have been ineffective of finding another way to fund in the state that the extraction of oil and mining. So the problem is not recent, but right now President Moreno, of all the measures that he can choose to take, he's taking the recipe of the IMF. So basically, he's gonna decrease tax for the wealthies. He's gonna increase gas prices by eliminating subsidies, and that is gonna impact the most poor people in the society, especially because the fares of the bus fares will be increasing, and the whole chain of prices will be affected, and also the changes to the labor laws. And that is really, really worrisome, because he wants to dismantle the workers' protection that we have in the law for several decades. And in the past, maybe 20 years ago, when we were discussing the free trade zone of the Americas, indigenous peoples rise and protest against that initiative, and actually they were able to stop that. And now we got the same attempt to dismantle workers' protection, and there is a strong campaign against public officers right now. And some of the measures that Moreno is willing to introduce attack directly to those workers. They're trying to decrease the pay vacations to them. They're going to take one day of salary of the public services, and also the new people that will work for the state will work with less payment and with less stability in their work contracts. So we got all these measures that are going to impact the worker class in Ecuador, and what we see with President Moreno is the lack of dialogue with the social movements and with the workers and with the worker class especially. We see, as Naomi Klein describes in his book about the doctrine of the shock doctrine, that there is a package of neoliberal measures that will be better received if the society is weak, and they are trying to weaken in the society by repression, by using the army, against protesters. That's where we are living now in Ecuador.
Professor David Cordero Heredia, as you speak to us from Quito, Ecuador, if you can talk about the state of the media, what media is allowed to operate and what media is getting shut down. We were just showing video of Radio Pichincha Universal, the radio that was reporting on what was happening on the ground, being stormed and shut down by police. Now Pichincha is saying that the radio director, Washington Yapez, there's an order to put him in jail on accusation of inciting discord among citizens. What are people learning? And also, do you have a death toll? Reports of gas bombs being thrown at medics and hospital tents, and the defense minister saying they will use live ammunition. The president and defense minister calling the protesters terrorists.
Yes, indeed, Amy. We are receiving reports of journalists that have been attacked by the police. We got several images that are in the internet now. And we got to divide the media right now in independent media and the mainstream media right now. And what mainstream media is doing is taking the discourse of the government. And the discourse of the government basically is that President Correa or former President Correa and President Maduro from Venezuela are putting these protesters together and is diminishing the response of the indigenous people and the students and the workers that are the people who actually are in the streets. So in one side we got that discourse and the media is reproducing that discourse, and the other side we got the independent media, and independent media is reporting the aggressions of both the police and the army to the protesters right now, but the the armed forces are not discriminating between these two groups. So the only reports of police brutality that we can see in the mainstream media is basically the brutality against journalists and not against the people. And besides that, what the mainstream media is reporting is basically the riots that actually are happening right now in some parts of the country, and are reporting the discourse of President Correa and his allies. And tweets from President Maduro saying that they are supporting the march. But actually what happened is that the indigenous people movement had been in resistance of President Correa presidency, and probably President Correa presidency was the most hard repression government that we have seen in the last years against indigenous peoples. Human rights organizations defend over 200 indigenous leaders that were prosecuted by President Correa government. And so right now that President Correa and his allies are trying to say that they are supporting the people, are supporting the indigenous movement, is a lie. And what is happening right now in Quito is that we have protests, we have social movements that are tired of being the ones to be impacted or to be asked to sacrifice in these moments of where we need to take new economic measures. So this discourse is the one that we can hear on the mainstream media.
And Professor, just quickly, if you could comment, you mentioned Venezuela and President Maduro. What's been the impact of the continuing crisis in Venezuela and the flight of so many Venezuelans out of the country to the situation right there in Ecuador?
Well, we are receiving thousands of people from Venezuela that are fleeing from a humanitarian crisis that is happening in Venezuela, and the impact to the society. The economical crisis is the crisis that we can wait of one of these kind of situations, but we had a lot of support for the international community and UN agencies. However, we got an increasing discourse from the government, a xenophobic discourse. President Moreno have put in force some measures to ban the migration from Venezuelan people. Some of them, most of them, are refugees under international law. However, they got to apply to a humanitarian visa from Colombia, basically before enter to Ecuador, and all these discourse of xenophobia, or all these discourse about the security being impacted by Venezuelans is deeply impacting the Venezuelan population living in Ecuador. And one of the things that is taking advance President Moreno is about what people feel about the Venezuelan migration in Ecuador. So he's blaming Venezuelans and he's blaming President Maduro of some of the violence that had been happening in the streets, but he doesn't have proofs of that. And probably right now the protests are happening all over the country, so probably some people from Venezuela are participating in those, but he doesn't have proof of that. And as human rights organizations that are with the people in the streets, in the jails, checking what is going on, we don't have evidence that Venezuelans are participating in the protests or they are producing the violence. So this discourse of Maduro sending Venezuelans to destabilize the government of Moreno is a lie.
And Professor, is a national strike called for today?
Yes, workers should be joining the national strike today. Also, indigenous people that are coming from all over the country are walking from their communities to the cities, So the national strike is continuing. They are demanding not just to go back with these neoliberal measures that Moreno is trying to implement, but also to stop the extractivism in Ecuador. The indigenous peoples, now that we are talking about climate change all over the world, indigenous people are offering us an alternative, a sustainable alternative of living. They want to protect their jungles. They want to protect their territories, and that is the message that they have to the world. That they got another way to see the world. That they can join the conversation about climate change, and that will be a very important ideas that we should take into account. However, former President Correa and President Moreno is not listening to them, and they want to extract more oil and destroying their territories and displace them.
Well, I want to thank you very much for being with us, Professor David Cordero Heredia, law professor at Pontifical Catholic University in Quito, Ecuador, one of the lawyers representing protesters who've been detained in this latest round of protests in Ecuador. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we go to Julian Castro, yes, a presidential candidate, but also was on the border trying to escort migrants into the United States. We'll find out what happened. Stay with us.
Me acerco, ya casi toco tu cuerpo, mis manos en movimiento y te hago flashear así.
Get Lit by the Ecuadorian musician Madre Chicha. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
We turn now to Democratic presidential candidate and former housing secretary Julian Castro. On Monday, he escorted a dozen asylum seekers to the U.S. port of entry at Brownsville, Texas, in a challenge to President Trump's Remain in Mexico policy. The group included a disabled Salvadoran woman and her relatives, as well as 9 LGBTQ people from Cuba, Guatemala, and Honduras. Many of them report they've been threatened and assaulted while they've been forced to wait in the Mexican border city of Matamoros. The asylum seekers were refused entry into the United States.
On Twitter, Julian Castro wrote, quote, "By law, these migrants are supposed to be exempt from the Remain in Mexico policy, but Customs and Border Protection had decided to ignore their due process. Outrageous." Julian Castro joins us now from San Antonio, the city where he served as mayor from 2009 to 2014, now attempting to become the first Latino president of the United States. Secretary Castro, welcome back to Democracy Now! Can you tell us exactly what you did this week?
Yeah, good morning. Thanks for having me. So I was invited by the Texas Civil Rights Project that works with migrants who are seeking asylum and who have been caught up in the Trump administration's Remain in Mexico policy, technically called the Migrant Protection Protocol policy, which has them claim asylum here and then sends them to wait in Mexico while their asylum claim is adjudicated. I've been asked to visit Matamoros on the other side of Brownsville, Texas, because you have about 1,000 people who are there, who most of whom are seeking asylum, waiting for their court dates, that are caught up in this Remain in Mexico policy. And we wanted to highlight especially the claims of members of the LGBTQ community, and also one person who is disabled. She's deaf. We were highlighting them specifically because under the terms of the Remain in Mexico policy itself, somebody with a physical issue or mental health trauma is supposed to be exempted. In other words, they're supposed to be allowed to remain in the United States while their claim is adjudicated instead of being sent back to Mexico. These members of the LGBTQ community, they have been persecuted, they've been subjected to violence, they've been threatened, they're suffering trauma, and some of them PTSD. And so we believe that they should qualify for that exemption because of the mental health trauma they're going through. And the person who is deaf has a physical disability, a physical issue. She never should have been put in that program in the first place. And let me just say, you know, when I went over there, as I mentioned, there are over 1,000 people. They're all living in tents. They told me to a person that they don't have clean water to drink, that a lot of the kids there are sick. I saw children as young as 12 days old, a baby that was 12 days old. They're living basically in a field that's right near the river, the Rio Grande River, and right next to the border station. So these are people who are in desperate circumstances, living in unsanitary conditions and squalor, not knowing what's going to happen to them, and pleading for help. We took these 12 individuals to present to the Border Patrol agents, CBP, and they were eventually interviewed, and then they were all sent back. They were all denied any kind of relief under the exemption in the MPP policy.
Well, Secretary Castro, I want to ask you, because obviously Mexico has to participate in this Remain in Mexico policy. And I don't know if you saw the op-ed piece that Jorge Ramos, the co-anchor of the national Univision News, had in the New York Times this week, where he said Mexico may not be paying for the wall, the Trump wall, but Mexico has effectively become the wall and is participating in this attempt of President Trump to prevent more people from coming into the country. I'm wondering about your sense of the Mexican policy under President López Obrador.
Yeah, I did not see that op-ed, but I think that Jorge puts it very well there, that this was something that Mexico agreed to. And to me, that was surprising, given the history of López Obrador and what I thought he would stand for and do once he was in office. The other thing that's been a concern is that, of course, for the municipality, for Matamoros and for the state government there, they do have a responsibility to help make sure that these individuals are safe, that they're living in sanitary conditions. I was told by one person on the other side of the border that the city is trying to do something, but trying to get folks to move to a different part of the community, of the city, where they've tried to establish more sanitary conditions and better living conditions. I don't know whether that's accurate or not. It may well be accurate, but that there's a hesitancy among the migrants there because of the lack of safety in other parts of the community, and they feel like they want to be there, of course, near the Border Patrol station when they have their hearing, or there's just this sense of being close to the United States, and so they've been hesitant to go to that other place that may have been established by the city for them to be at.
So what are you demanding of the president right now?
Well, he should end this policy. If I were elected president, I would immediately end this Remain in Mexico policy. It flies in the face of the United States policy of allowing people who are making a claim of asylum to remain in the United States while their claim is adjudicated. So we need to do a couple of things. Number one, we need to end this policy and allow people to remain in the safety of the United States. Secondly, and just as importantly, we actually need to create an independent immigration court system that's independent from the Department of Justice, with enough judges and support staff to hear these asylum claims and get people an answer in a timely manner. Some people will get asylum. We also know that some people will not, but people should not be waiting years to get an answer on their asylum claim.
Let me ask you about the New York Times report, recently reporting President Trump privately pushed for shooting migrants and for creating a, quote, water-filled trench stocked with snakes or alligators along the U.S.-Mexico border. The Times also detailing how Trump has privately proposed other radical measures to curtail immigration, including closing the entire U.S.-Mexico border and building an electrified border wall topped with spikes to pierce fierce human flesh. The Times revealing Trump has repeatedly raised the idea of shooting migrants during staff meetings. The paper reporting after publicly suggesting that soldiers shoot migrants if they threw rocks, the president backed off when his staff told him that was illegal. But later in a meeting, aides recalled, he suggested they shoot migrants in the legs to slow them down. That's not allowed either, they told him. The Times article is based on the new book, Border Wars, Inside Trump's Assault on Immigration by the Times reporters Michael D. Shear and Julie Hirschfeld Davis. Julian Castro, if you could respond.
I mean, that's the product of a deranged mind right there. What else can we say about that except that's an individual with a deranged mind and obviously a lot of hate toward these migrants. And, you know, this is the caliber of person that's sitting in the Oval Office right now. It's just one more example of why he should not be president of the United States. Somebody who is not only hateful, but who is so divorced from reality that he would, on multiple occasions, bring up the idea of shooting people. It makes no sense. I hope that more and more Americans are paying attention to the depravity of this president and the cruelty that he's inflicted on people that are simply seeking a better life. And that's consistent with people from different places all over the world that have come seeking a better life, who have come from desperate circumstances throughout the generations. And so this is nothing new in our country's history or the history of the world. My hope is that this president is going to be held to account for what he's done in terms of violating his oath of office and abusing his power, that he will be impeached, that he'll be removed from office. If he is not impeached and removed, he's going to be defeated on November 3rd, 2020, and that this nightmare with respect to how he's treating migrants will be over.
Secretary Castro, I wanted to ask you also, because the president often talks about how he's opposed to people coming into the country illegally. But the reality is that his policies in terms of even legal immigration are dramatically different from past policies. I think the Census Bureau is reporting we had the lowest number of legal immigrants admitted into the country, just a couple of 100,000 compared to an average of about 1 million a year in many past years. The reduction in refugee admissions, the clampdown on asylum requests. Could you talk about his policy toward legal immigration?
Yeah, sometimes it makes some folks feel good when they can say, well, I'm not really against, or the president is not really against immigration. He's against undocumented immigrants or so-called illegal immigrants. But as you point out, clearly this is an assault on all immigrants, undocumented and documented. This public charge rule that they've proposed that would essentially chill legal immigrants from participating in American life, the cutbacks to the number of refugees that we'll accept, also this asylum policy that has been tightened, this Remain in Mexico policy that would deal with potential asylees. In all of these ways, the president has sought to curtail legal immigration. So at the bottom of this is truly a vision of America that looks like Donald Trump. That's what he wants. That's what he's trying to create. And so people should not fool themselves. What I believe is that our diversity in this country makes us strong, that we can harness the potential of immigrants, and that for generations, immigrants, both documented and undocumented, have made this country stronger, have powered our economy, have helped ensure that we continue to move forward as a nation. And that's going to continue to be the case in the future. And I believe that we should increase the number of people that we're taking in as refugees and asylees, and that we should put undocumented immigrants who are here in the United States on a pathway to citizenship as long as they have not committed a serious crime here in the United States. That's what I would do as president.
Two quick questions, Julian Castro. One, the latest news, Turkey's government saying its troops are prepared for an imminent assault on Kurdish fighters in northern Syria. This after President Trump's surprise announcement that he's ordering U.S. troops to fall back from their positions on the Turkish-Syrian border. The Kurdish fighters saying they're bracing for a humanitarian catastrophe. Can you respond to President Trump's latest move and also talk about his refusal to cooperate with the impeachment inquiry?
This is a stunning betrayal of allies in Syria. These Kurds have fought alongside the United States, pushing back ISIS. They have been vital to our success there. Now, look, I agree with a lot of people that we need to withdraw from Syria, but there's a difference in doing that in a thoughtful way that's respectful of our allies and one in a way that betrays them, and also sends a signal to allies around the world that the United States is not going to stand up for you. And that's exactly what this president is doing. He has been condemned on the left and the right for doing this because of the manner in which he's doing it. And it has been baffling the way that this president has handled foreign policy. Very haphazard, erratic, undisciplined, self-interested as well. And more examples of how unfit for office Donald Trump is. I mean, he never should have been in the Oval Office in the first place, and we've seen so many examples. The way that he's betrayed the Kurds is just one more example of that. With regard to the impeachment inquiry, we have a constitutional crisis on our hands now, because what the administration just said in the letter they sent to Speaker Pelosi yesterday is, you can't review us. You have no power over the president or the administration to review our actions. Where do you go from there except to say that they're denying the authority of Congress under the Constitution? He is now obstructing justice again. This itself should qualify as an impeachable offense, and I expect that it will be part of the charge on impeachment. Congress needs to move forward swiftly to hold this administration accountable for President Trump's violation of his oath of office, his abuse of power. We have never seen anything like this. Even Richard Nixon was not this brazen. And I believe that in short order, what you're going to get is a lot of damning evidence, a lot more. We've already seen some, a lot more damning evidence. And the polling that is coming out showing that support, even among Republicans and independents, for impeachment and removal, that is skyrocketing in support of that, is going to continue because people can see for their, with their own eyes and hear with their own ears evidence that shows he doesn't belong in office.
We just have 10 seconds, but your response to Bernie Sanders, his heart attack last week, you're the rival in the Democratic presidential primaries.
Well, I wish Bernie well. I mean, he's done fantastic work over the years. He looked good when I saw him, at least the shots that I saw. I think he's going to come back strong, and I look forward to seeing him out there on the campaign trail.
Julian Castro, I want to thank you for being with us. 2020 Democratic presidential candidate, served as Secretary of Housing and Urban Development from 2014 to 2017. When we come back, we look at Tuesday's Supreme Court oral arguments deciding whether LGBTQ workers can be legally fired due to their sexual orientation or gender identity. Stay with us. We'll be back in 30 seconds.
Strangers stare and they wanna be the first to ask for my life in one word. But it's not that simple. Why do you care to know? Am I a boy or a girl? But I don't care about the answers. The questions were boring.
Tell Me a Story by Skylar Kurgel. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, the Supreme Court heard oral arguments Tuesday in 3 cases that will determine whether LGBTQ people can be fired from their jobs due to their sexual orientation or gender identity. Among the court's conservative justices, only Neil Gorsuch appeared open to prohibiting such workplace discrimination. One of the cases centers on a transgender woman from Michigan named Amy Stevens, who was fired from her job at a funeral home in 2013. She spoke outside the court on Tuesday.
I would like to say thank you for all the support that I'm getting. I appreciate each and every one of you. I'm glad to have been able to bring this before the courts. And what happened to me was wrong. And hopefully we can fix that and correct it from this point on.
Well, for more, we're joined by James Essex, director of the ACLU LGBT and HIV Project. He attended Tuesday's oral arguments before the Supreme Court. Thanks so much for being with us. We just have a few minutes. What surprised you most? Lay out the key questions and where you think the court's going.
Sure. So the key question here is it sex discrimination to fire someone because they're transgender or lesbian, gay, or bisexual? And obviously our position is that of course it is. You can't explain who a transgender person is without talking about the person's sex. You can't explain who a gay, lesbian, or bisexual person is without talking about both the sex of the individual and the sex of the person that the person is attracted to. So what else could it be other than sex discrimination? Lower courts have increasingly recognized that indeed anti-LGBT discrimination is a form of sex discrimination and have allowed LGBT plaintiffs to win cases to redress discrimination in a wide range of contexts, from employment to housing to education in the schools and access to health care. And all of that is at risk here because the Trump administration was in the U.S. Supreme Court yesterday asserting that it should be legal under federal law to fire people just because they're transgender or just because they're lesbian, gay, or bisexual. Now, that's kind of astounding by itself and a complete turnabout, the position that the Obama administration took. In fact, the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, a federal agency whose job is to enforce the federal law that bars sex discrimination, the EEOC brought the lawsuit against the funeral home on behalf of Amy Stevens. And now what we have is the EEOC, represented by the Justice Department, in the United States Supreme Court, arguing the other side of the case, saying we should never have brought the case because there was no violation of law there. So in terms of what happened in court, the question in any case like this is, okay, do we have 5 votes? So the 4 more liberal justices had a bunch of questions, but my takeaway is that I think that they would vote for the plaintiffs, for the employees on both of these issues. As has been reported widely, Justice Gorsuch asked many questions of both sides and seemed to be wrestling with this issue in a way that his colleagues on the right were perhaps not.
And he's what's known as a textualist?
Indeed, he is a textualist. And what that means is that a textualist says, look, I don't really care what Congress was thinking about when they passed the law. I'm not so worried about what they thought they were doing. I'm going to look at the words that they used, and I'm going to figure out what do they mean in real life and apply them as such. And so the arguments from the Trump administration were largely non-textualist arguments. They were saying Congress wasn't thinking about LGBT people in 1964. Our point that seemed to appeal to Justice Gorsuch is it doesn't matter what Congress was thinking about. The question is, the statute says no sex discrimination. Sex is supposed to be irrelevant to people's ability to perform work, and that is what happened here. And what about Kavanaugh? So Justice Kavanaugh asked one question that was not particularly illuminative, and so we're not sure. I can't tell from that where he is going to come out. Justice Gorsuch seems to be wrestling with this, had questions for both sides, and I think that he thinks that my sense is he thinks that yes, sex was one of the reasons that Amy Stevens was fired and that the 2 gay men were fired. I think he's also wrestling with a separate set of questions, which is dress codes, restrooms, how does that all work out? They're worried about the consequences of ruling for the LGBT plaintiffs.
Well, we want to thank you for being with us, and of course we'll continue to follow this. James Essex, director of the ACLU LGBT and HIV Project. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Thanks so much for joining us.